Hello everyone, I hope I find you all well. Welcome to the technology webinar series of the Impact Project. My name is Marcelo Royan. I'm the technical leader here at Impact, and I'll be hosting this webinar today for you. Before we start, let me introduce the scope and nature of what we're going to see in the next minutes. This is a series of webinars that we have set up here at Impact with the goal of explaining what the FIWARE technology is and how you can take advantage of it. FIWARE technology is one of the main benefits of our program, and it's also a requirement if you wish to participate in our program. These webinars are aimed at introducing and explaining these technologies and helping you to better understand and use them in your projects. In the first webinar, we saw together an introduction to FIWARE technology to get in touch with the technology itself, and we saw how you can use it to help you build your project. It was a general introduction to the technology. Then, in the second webinar, we talked through the different FIWARE components and modules with the goal of helping you better understand the whole ecosystem possibilities and resources. As we saw, resources are a very important part of the FIWARE ecosystem, and I always remind you of this because it's very important. Every partner involved in both the FIPPP and the FIWARE projects has put a lot of effort in the development of the technologies and the accompanying tutorials, websites, and other helpful resources. So I really want to suggest you check all the resources that you have at your disposal when designing your application's FIWARE architecture. Then, in the third Impact webinar, we saw some interesting and first-hand insights about the use of enablers and their integration in your project's architecture. For example, we saw how enablers differ from each other, not just in their area and functionality, but also in their coverage, their maturity, and the scope. Finally, in the fourth Impact webinar, we extended our vision of FIWARE enablers and the added value that their integration represents. We concentrated the webinar on the interaction of different enablers that fit together and allow your application to reach a high degree of features. We showed how you can use Orion Context Broker along with a few other prominent enablers and interconnect them to get valuable features that can help you get your application to the next level. So now it's time to get into bigger detail and hands-on with the central enabler of the FIWARE architecture, Orion. We'll explain what context management is and how you can make use of Orion Context Broker enabler in your project. By now, you shall have a wide view of the use of FIWARE and its integration in your architecture. Of course, this webinar will be followed by others which will keep up to date the concepts that we're going to talk about now. The webinar will be partly based on documentation made by Fermín Galán and Leandro Guillén from FIWARE organization, and I want to take the opportunity to thank both of them for their effort in conceiving not just this presentation and documentation, but many other documents that help FIWARE get where it is. Fermín and Leandro, thank you very much. This is the structure of the information I wish to present you with today, following what I just introduced. First is this introduction. As I said, we will begin by taking a wide look at the Orion Context Broker in its basics feature. We already had an introduction to the enabler in the preceding webinar. So today we're going to go into bigger detail about the basics of this enabler, which is a basis in the FIWARE architecture, and then we'll see also some advanced topics on the enablers so that you have a full view of all it can do for you. Then we will end up with some exercises in which you can put into practice all the information and all the concepts that we will be seeing before that. And we will finish the webinar, of course, with a section dedicated to the next steps so that you really know where you are and where you have to go from now. At the end of the session, we'll finish with these proposed exercises and a review of everything and some clear next steps for you to follow if you're interested in having your project backed by impact. And this is going to be also an important part of the webinar today. All right, let's start then if you're ready. I have included in the documentation that you will get along with this webinar some information, some recap about the preceding webinars and with their URLs, and also a brief summary of what they're about. It's quite important that you follow an order in the webinars, because each of them talks about concepts that have been introduced by the preceding one. So it's important that you see them all together, I mean, in following the order. The first webinar was just an introduction to FIWARE technology and its architecture, and it was meant to help you understand the ecosystem. You can see it here. You have the direct link to the video. You can also go to the YouTube channel from Impact, where you will get all of them. Second webinar was dedicated to the different FIWARE components, modules, and the resources. In the third webinar, we tried to help you understand how to approach the application architecture through a deep look at the enablers insights and the interactions between them. And then in the fourth webinar, we saw how the different enablers fit together, how they complement and interact with each other, and we also looked at real-life examples. So let's go with our webinar today, the fifth webinar. All right, let's go. As I said, some of the information we're going to use in this webinar was created by Fermín Galán and Leandro Guillén. It's part of the FIWARE documentation. This one is based on the Orion Context broker. This is the structure of what we're going to see in the next minutes. First, we're going to explain what is context management. Then we will introduce the Orion Context broker enabler. We'll take a look at what is creating and pulling data and how you can do it using the enabler. And also, we'll see the other side of the enabler, which is to push data and notifications to the enabler. And then we'll see examples of standard operations. Let's go into that. What is context management and what is context information that we care about managing it? Context information is anything that our application is going to process about its environment. It can be something physical, like a bus stop, for example, or it can be a virtual environment. It's a very low-level thing. So basically, we have things that are called entities that have attributes. So for example, an entity can be a bus or a shop. For example, other entities can be a user. This context information environment and concept allows you to treat the context information from a standard point of view. This is very helpful because when you implement a smart application, you need to gather and manage context information. As I was saying, context information refers to the values of attributes that characterize entities that are relevant to the application. So with context information management, you can have the information about objects and entities that is changing a long time, and you can handle it and manage it without caring for the way this information is produced and stored. For example, you get an abstraction layer with this information layer, and you can have the location of a bus, for example, your application can read into it without caring for how this information was written to the system, whether it was done by the bus itself or a middle system or whatever. Context information can come from many sources. It can come from existing systems. It can come from users, for example, through the use of mobile apps. It can come from sensor networks, which is connected to the Internet of Things element. Something that is really important to understand is that the source of information for a given entity or attribute may change over time, and all you would care about from your application is to read this changing of information when it's done. Another important feature in the context information management is that you're able from your application to get information from different systems about the same object, and you don't really care from the different information pieces come from. So for example, in a bus, for the entity bus, you could have the attribute location coming from the production system A, and then information on the attribute driver, which is an attribute from the object bus, coming from a different context provider called B. This is a very interesting approach because it allows you to integrate your application with existing or future systems that deals with the management of centralized services without impacting their architectures, because you get the information in an abstract way from the context broker, and it's the producers, the system that produce the information, that need to care about how they get the information to the broker. But you don't have to change anything in the way you consume this information. So it allows your application to rely on a single model that adapts to the system, to the different systems, and that can be applied to the smart cities context. And this is where the NGSI API comes in. This is where it all makes sense, as it acts as a connector between the different systems using the enabler. NGSI stands for Next Generation Standard Interface, and it's used by all the FIWARE enablers to connect among each other. It's the API that you use to send the data back and forth between the different entities and systems through the context broker. This works on top of the HTTP protocol, so it's a standard interface, and it's a really light one. And thanks to it, the fact of capturing data or acting upon IoT devices is as easy as to read change the value of the attributes that are linked to the context entities just using the context broker. So for example, issuing a get operation on the present sensor attribute of a lamp enables the application to get the information about the presence of people near this lamp, whereas the lamp sets the value of the attribute status to light on, and this triggers the execution of a function in the IoT device that switches the lamp on. And the context broker is in the middle of these operations. So as NGSI works on top of HTTP, it's just based on a web server and that is able to manage get and put requests. And so that's the way you call an enabler method over NGSI using a get, a put, or a REST operation. In fact, there are two versions of the NGSI API. One is more REST-like API, and the other one is more similar to remote call protocol. So now we'll see some examples of how we'll go through this concept during this session. on how you can make these calls and how this NGSI protocol and calls work. Another example would be with a plant. So if an application issues a get operation on the humidity attribute, this enables the application to find out whether the plant has to be watered. And on the other side, the plant or the pot could set up the value of the attribute status to watering, and that would trigger the execution of a function in the IoT device that waters the plant. So as I said before, the FIWARE NGSI API is RESTful. So this means that it's a standard API. So any web programmer, any developer is gonna be able to quickly get used to it. This is something really powerful, as with the rest of the FIWARE technologies, it's implemented as open standards. This is something that is really important for us. Okay, so in the context broker, you always have entities and attributes. And using the RESTful NGSI API, you can get information on any attribute of any given entity and at any point of time. So everything is going to be an entity with attributes. When you design your application, you have to model all the information you need to care about as entities that have attributes. And then you can take advantage of NGSI. Therefore, it's very important that you're able to model your application as entities that have attributes. Not only because you will be able to use Orion then, but also because you're going to be able to take advantage of the whole FIWARE architecture advantages, because they all work with this NGSI architecture based on entities and attributes. It's always up to you to define the level at which you're gonna define your entities and attributes, whether it's high level or low level. Like for example, let's say that you wanna handle like a class of students. You could decide that a student is an entity that has its attributes, like for example, his name, his age, his gender, whatever. Or you can decide that the entity is a class and the student, each of the students is an attribute of this entity class. So it's up to you to decide how you want to handle this model. But you always will take advantage of the architecture if you define this model, whether as a high level or a low level architecture. From the definition I just made about entities and attributes, there's something that is really important that you need to think about. And this is that you don't always need Orion, you don't always need a context broker in your application. It only makes sense when you're really able to model the information that you treat on your application using entities and attributes, and also based on the fact that the information you generate can be consumed by other applications, or the other way around, that you can consume information produced by other applications. Maybe also a part of your application can produce the information and another part can consume it. But Orion will only make sense when these two parts can be separated. If they can't be separated, or if it doesn't make sense to separate them, then you're better off using a simple database where you store information on objects. I hope this is clear for you, because this is something really important in the impact projects. Here you can see the architecture of the context broker, and if you're familiar with a web server, the enabler is very similar to a web server. You've got requests coming to you as updates or as queries, and the context broker just answers them. It queries the database. The two requests the context broker gets are of type, okay, this is the information I want you to store about this entity, or it can be the other way. So please give me this information, this precise information about a specific entity. To get information about a specific attribute on an entity, your application needs to use what is called a subscription. Subscriptions are the way that applications can get information about a specific entity. For example, your application would set up a subscription for the change of the attribute location pertaining to the entity bus, to specific entity bus. So in fact, the context broker doesn't really act exactly as a web server because it can get queries, but it also acts as a push, in a push way, because when it has subscriptions, it sends up information to the applications that are subscribed to a specific change in some data. And by the way, the database here is a MongoDB database. Another important thing to take into account is that the context broker is headed, its approach is a real-time approach. So whenever you have an application that has a subscription, for example, to the attribute location of an entity bus, it's going to get the real-time location of the bus. So the real-time value of the attribute for the entity. But it's not going to get the history of it. So it's a matter of real time. Of course, you could use your own application to store all the data regarding the different states that a specific attribute of an entity has along time. This is something that the application has to do, not the context broker. The context broker is going to concentrate on real-time data. Okay, so all the calls you can make to the context broker will have this form. This is an example of a GET operation, of a HTTP GET operation. You got the host, and then the port by default is 1026. So, for example, you can call the method version on this URL, which hosts a context broker, and you'll get a similar response as this one. So, with the version information, uptime, the hash, compile time, a few things. In fact, for example, we can go live and see an example of this. I have a REST client here in my browser. This is just the usual REST client, and we're gonna check the version of a live context broker instance. So you just write the host, and then using the port 1026, we're gonna use the version method. So if you send the request, you get the reply here. You can see 200 code for the reply, and then the response body. So it's XML, as you can see, and you have the version of the context broker that is running on this host, and then the rest of the information. So uptime, git hash, compile time, and so on and so forth. You'll be able to check all the methods that we'll be using on this live version. In that way, you can make all the operations, several operations. These are the operations you'll make most of the time regarding entities. You can retrieve or create an entity, you can update it, or you can even delete it. You can also query any attributes for specific entities. So that would be the syntax that you would need to use. For example, get context entities, the ID of the entity, and then attributes and the name of the attribute that would give you an attributes value. And if you do a post operation, you can create a new attribute for a specific entity. You can put content, so to update an attribute's value, or you can even delete an attribute. If you do any of this on the using the REST client, you're gonna get a response. Even if you wanna know what entities are created in a specific context broker instance, you can just call the v1 context entities method without an entity ID, and you get everything that's there. Let's make a call to the context entities method without providing an entity ID, sorry, and you'll see that we'll get all the entities on the server. So here we are. So we got many entities here. Entity type room, the ID, the entity ID. So you have all the information here. You see how it's working real time. This is XML. You can also have it in JSON as we were seeing before. This is just because it's default to XML, and this is the information you get. Here we have an example of context broker operations, where you have an application that creates data and an application that pulls this data. The context producer is the one that publishes data, and they use the update context operation on the context broker, whereas the context consumers can retrieve the data using the query context operation of the context broker. In this example, a car would be pushing and updating the context related to its speed to the context broker, and at the same time, an application would be using the context broker, the query context of the context broker, to get this information about the speed of the car and present it in its interface. And this is an example of the context producer writing the value for the attribute of an entity. It's using a post request, so it's a post HTTP request, and it's using a JSON object. To create a car, it gives an ID and the value for the attribute speed. The answer, so the context broker would reply with an OK and explaining, saying that the create operation went fine. And this is an update of the attribute of the car. So the entity that was just created, this is an operation to update the information. So basically, this is a car saying like, okay, now the value for the attribute speed is now 110. And of course, you then have the reply of the context broker again saying, okay. This is an example of the application getting the status, getting the value of the speed attribute of the car entity. So it's a get method. And then again, the reply, 200 HTTP reply. This is another example of the client getting the speed, so the attribute from the entity, and just to show you that it's being updated, the value returned by the context broker is updated because the content producer just updated it before. And this is another example of a post request. So it's creating an entity, and it's just to show that you can create an entity with two attributes and give them both values at the same time. And then, of course, you can also update the values of several attributes in just one single call, like we're doing here. See, it's a put method for the room one, and it's updating both the temperature attribute and the pressure attribute. Then, of course, if you get the attributes using a client, you'll get the new values. This is just to show you this, how it works. I guess that by now you have a clear idea of how the context broker works and how the methods work. If you use a GET request to an entity without specifying any attribute, so for example, in that example, you are calling the GET entities of a specific entity, room 1, without specifying the attributes, the context broker is gonna give you all the attributes that the entity has with their corresponding values. This is another example, and this is the creation of a new entity, room 2. On the same creation request, you can specify several attributes with their values, and so both attributes are gonna get created and the values assigned to them. In this new example, we're using what we call a pattern, and so we're querying some entity, some different entities of the context broker, and we want to get all the attributes for all the entities of type room. And so we're using a regular expression here on the ID of the entity part of the query, and we're using dot dash, which is a regular special expression, and it's gonna get us all the attributes of all the entities beginning with room. So the response is gonna be this one. See, you have the room 1 with all its attributes, and then room 2 with its attributes, and so on. We have briefly talked about subscriptions sooner, and we're gonna see some examples of how they work. As I was saying, context consumer can subscribe to receive context information that satisfy specific conditions using the subscribed context. Then, whenever an application subscribes to a subscribed context, the context broker notifies updates on this information to the context consumers by using the notify context operation with an export. For example, that would be the creation request for a subscription from a client application. The syntax of this subscription goes, the application wants to get notified whenever the entity called or having the ID room 1 has its attribute temperature changed. So the client application will receive the value of the attribute temperature of the entity room 1 whenever this temperature changes. Well, that would be the response of the context broker to this subscription creation. And then, for example, whenever the temperature, the real temperature, goes from 25 to 19 degrees, automatically the context broker will post a request, an HTTP request, to the host and port that were configured on it, and it will send the information about the change. As a summary, in NGSI, the operations update context, query context, subscribe context, and the update context subscription and unsubscribe correspond to the function of query update and subscription and subscription to context elements. All of them use post requests. All right, then this is it for the basics of Orion Context Broker. Then there's the question of how to get Orion. You got the FIWARE Lab image, which is there on the FIWARE Lab. You also can have it through the blueprints, also on the FIWARE lab, and you could have it as a virtual box image for your own computer or for your own server on a virtual server here from this address. And then you also have Docker images. So those of you that are familiar with Docker, you can get the Docker image there, and it's much easier to deploy Orion. Okay, you also have the Orion Context Explorer, which is browser-based front end for Orion, and of course you can use the REST client as we showed before. Okay, this is the GitHub address for the enabler, and you're gonna find many implementations of context broker integrations in GitHub and elsewhere. These are some of them. This is the context adapter for CatoDB. Very interesting development. I suggest you have a look at it. You also have an NGSI plugin for Freeboard. Freeboard, as you know, or as you may know, is a dashboard. It's an open source project, so you can create a dashboard for your entities using the NGSI plugin. So as you see, the enabler is pretty powerful, not just by itself, but also because it's enriched by everything that is being built around it. Like, for example, all these plugins. So I encourage you to build a project that connects to the enabler, maybe, not just make use of it. We've already had some examples here at Impact of projects implementing things that connect to the Orion. Well, if you like to know more, as you know, there are many resources on the internet regarding FIWARE and specifically regarding Orion Context Broker. You've got a few of them here. So you have the presentation, of course, the Orion catalog, the support through Stack Overflow. You have many sources of information on the internet. So go ahead and take a look at them to learn more about Orion. Here we have the advanced topics. We're not gonna get into them. You can have them on this presentation and take a look on your side. I just want to show that Orion is able to do many more things, like these advanced topics like pagination or geolocation, the management of metadata, entity service paths, many things that I encourage you to look at. All right, we've gotten to this point where it's now mostly you who needs to practice with everything we learned and to learn even more about Orion. Place to go for the exercises. This is the URL. You have a full load of exercises here that will allow you to advance on your knowledge of Orion. You'll find many exercises regarding Orion, from the basic ones about deploying your Orion instance, creating entities, query entities, update entities using standard ops, update several entities, updating attributes, creating entities, updating entities, browsing them, and all these kinds of operations. You get like really used to it. We're getting to the end of this webinar, but before we're over, I want to stress what are the next steps for you if you want to apply to Impact regarding the FIWARE technology. Your next steps towards the use of FIWARE technology and therefore towards participation in Impact is First, I would use the catalog to identify and select the general enablers that really fit your project's needs, and I would classify them by priority. Then I would use FIWARE School and other online resources to learn more about these selected GEs and how to implement them in your project. I would then set up an account at FIWARE Lab, or maybe you already have one if you created it to do the exercises, and I would use it to test the identified general enablers and your developments in a live environment. Then I would modify your application architecture to make room for FIWARE. And always remember that all the FIWARE enablers make up an ecosystem. So interaction is key to make projects work. Orion Context Broker is one of the most generic and widely used enablers. So I really recommend that you take the time to see how it can fit your project. We've gotten to the end of this webinar. I hope it was useful for you and that you know a little bit better the Orion Context Broker by now and that you're able to use it in your application. Thank you very much for your attention and see you in the next webinar. Bye. Thanks.